All right, I see people joining. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our session today. I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Her name is Denae Ford, and she's a senior researcher at Microsoft Research in the Saints group, and also an affiliate professor at the Human Centered Design and Engineering Department at University of Washington. And her research lies at the intersection of human-computer interaction and software engineering. We were actually just talking that she's attending the CHI conference, which is the HCI side of things, and also a software engineering conference, which I'm not as familiar with, but I'm sure is also equally exciting. So in her work, she identifies and dismantles cognitive and social barriers by designing new mechanisms to support software developer participation in online socio-technical systems. She's best known for her research on just-in-time mentorship as a mode to empower welcoming engagement in collaborative Q&A for online programming communities, including open source communities, and work to empower marginalized software developers in online communities. She did her PhD in computer science at North Carolina State University. And I actually asked her to share a fun fact that people may not know about her. And it was a quite surprising fun fact. She was Division I in the NCAA of runner, a track and field runner. So quite impressive, both on the academic side as well as on the athletic side. So I'm very excited to have Denae here with us. And yeah, please take it away.
Great. So thank you so much for that marvelous introduction, Andres. I'm really honored and excited to be virtually here at the Center of Information Technology Policy Series. As Andres mentioned, I'm Denae. I am a researcher at Microsoft Research and an affiliate at UW. And my work has really led me to an intersection of software engineering, HCI, and online communities, where I studied the experiences of people in the margins, as well as novices. So today I'm going to talk about when we think about the next generation of software developers, what we should be thinking about and the best way to help us prepare for them. And to get started, I want to make sure your wheels are turning in the right direction. So I want you all to close your eyes for a moment, and I want you to picture what a software engineer looks like. Okay. Well, let's be honest, you're most likely thinking of someone who looks a lot like this, right? But I would challenge you to shift your thinking to the emerging diverse groups of people learning to code and thus entering the technical workforce. So there has been an extremely large global emphasis on bringing diverse people into technology. But what about the resources to keep them here? Right. So my work tackles this by, one, understanding the experiences of marginalized people and marginalized programmers in these communities. And then two, designing systems to better support all programmers. So essentially learning from the few to help the many. And the problem that I'm really going to be discussing a little bit more today is, or that we're facing in the industry, is that there's not enough developers, right, to meet our global demands. So in fact, after the great lockdown, as many are calling it, predictive reports of economic growth claim we can expect to see an even bigger spike in the demand for software engineers by the year 2025. Of the 149 million new jobs that will be created, 67% of those would be software engineers. So that's 98 million developers globally. These numbers are way too large just to only consider using tools to close this gap. So to do that, we're going to have to take a step back and ask ourselves, how do we empower more people to become software developers? What I will posit to you all is that in order to grow the next generation of developers, we should be looking to the communities they engage in and the resources they use to actually become successful. So what I've engaged, or what most of my research is focusing on, is the online communities they use to do this. So although this talk is really focused on the next generation of developers, it's really about the intergenerational developer communities folks are engaging in. And to keep this talk brief, I would kind of condense my argument into three core areas to support the intergeneration of software developers. And I would say that what drives them, what they're motivated by, is this clarity, or it's important to support them by, is the clarity of the work itself, the alignment of their passion and goals in that work, and also how they work in their setting. So the social transparency aspect, which is the clarity of the work itself, is really transparency about what the role may include. And one thing about the alignment of passion, considering the societal impact, right? The goals of the work and how they can see the impact of their work. And then third, that hybrid work setting, as in that flexibility of work setting, where they work, and how they feel supported to work in the most efficient way for them. So I'll cover a research project in each of these three areas. And the first one I'll start with is the social transparency. And this is ultimately rooted in the idea that social media has provided software developers as well as knowledge workers to showcase their work and their suite of expertise through tools or online platforms, really. Okay, so for one of the projects, we did this by understanding how developers engage in blogs. So blogs or video blogs have been a powerful tool for sharing personal experiences online. And they are often used as a vessel for understanding experiences of individuals on a day-to-day basis that are not always easily showcased in text. So for example, explaining collaborative work such as software development can be made easier by showing people rather than telling them. So looking at blogs or reading books, right? So beyond explaining a technical concept, blogs can be inserts into the full experiences that people face as an alternative to shadowing a person all day. So in these settings, shadowers can get a deep understanding for the entire role, which is especially important for the increasingly high demand career of software development. So what I have here is a clip from one of our developer blogs, Mayuko, who was showcasing a day in the life of a developer. So I'll quickly play this video. Okay, cool. So these types of videos are quite intentional, right? So they show that developers are more than just nerds behind computers all day. They lead a normal life. They're not all on the traditional path to learning programming. So in the video, you saw Maiko at the computer, eating lunch, actually working on code, having a meeting with her team, a Scrum meeting, right? So again, showing this whole range of the developer experience and actually, in fact, showing how collaborative it can be. So again, they lead this normal life. They're not just nerds behind a computer all day. However, many see them as these math wizards, if you will. So to really learn a special type, or learn from a special type of knowledge worker, developers, we're looking at this first person perspective. So we conducted several studies to kind of understand how developers describe a day in their life through vlogs on YouTube. And these were received, and understanding how these were received by the broader community. So the first research question we have here, again, are what are the motivations and intentions for creating this type of video? What kind of content do developers share? And then what kind of interactions are based around these videos? Okay, here. Does someone have a question? Or? Okay. Oopsies, I think I actually clicked too far. And then understanding the kinds of content they want to share, the interactions they have around these videos, and then how can they support the broader research or the broader community of developers. So for our first research question was, again, understanding the motivations. We're looking at the actual developers. So we have 16 developers, developer bloggers, and we interviewed them. They're across 4 continents. You see that they have a range of experiences. Some are software engineers, some are senior developers or full stack developers, and some just really branded themselves as creators at this point because they've been really kind of motivated to showcase different experiences. To answer the other additional questions we had, we analyzed 103 videos, which is about over 18 hours of video with 35 million views, again, across the 21 countries. And then the goal, again, was to really understand deeper content analysis, the day in the life, and then understanding what type of impact people are receiving from watching these videos or even engaging in the community around these videos. So for the motivations, we identified that developers were motivated to blog as a vehicle to break misconceptions against what people thought developers were. Also to help marginalized communities around the world overcome some of these barriers. So developers were very motivated to promote overall diversity within the community, and they use these blogs to present useful information, resources, and really trying to motivate people to join the career of software development. And these are a way to kind of encourage them to look at this community long term. So I want to kind of call out two quotes from participants. One was along the axes of demystifying their identity, and the second around creating awareness. So on the identity front, well, one participant went on to say, devs are living, breathing humans who are dynamic and have their own lives and interests, even outside of coding. And then around the awareness aspect, they're interested in spreading the message that anyone can basically learn to code and get into tech and create videos and vlogs about the technologies and how people learn these things and how they can help. And this is really important to share because as we think about the next generation of developers, we want to figure out how we can, again, demystify, bring people in so that it's not as daunting, right? We're talking about shifting our mode of what the developer can look like. To answer research question 2, we're looking at the content analysis. So we see a variety of topics discussed in the blogs where developers are sharing their experiences from learning programming and their career as a developer transitioning in different situations. So to their journey as a developer, being and understanding the long-term goals and decisions and how it impacts their quality of life. So I have 2 things I want to call out here, which are this collaboration and creativity, and then how that changes into their life pre and post pandemic and how they do and now integrate remote work into their setting. So along the collaboration creativity, we saw several videos described how important it was for developers to have adequate communication skills. And then often you get a lot of more done when you have quick conversations with the rest of your team. So this is one of the quotes from the participants. And again, looking at the respect of hybrid settings or remote work and how that impacts developers, even pre-pandemic, before the pandemic and even during. Some of these pre-COVID vlogs were really clear about the uses of co-working spaces, the flexibility, again, in that setting developers can have. Even during the pandemic, we saw a lot of videos about how people structured their work to get deep work done, focused work done, and how they're also able to make meaningful connections by discussing their stories and overcoming the challenges of the lack of social engagement, for example. And then also how they're managing career transitions. So for RQ3, which again was that comment analysis, we're seeing that commenters use blogs to find information related to their work and lifestyle of developers, seek advice about technology and careers, as well as express empathy and discover a community of people who they can relate to. So commenters really praised the portrayal of the realistic lifestyle of developers, which often contradict the beliefs and stereotypes. So where people mention that, software engineering is not just equal to coding. It's about the human interactions. It's about the collaboration. It's about the decision and the execution of how you work through your code and the impacts of the tools that you're building. So along the communities, communities were also very interested in how they were forming bonds over one another based on their different demographic identities. So forming communities around race, region, religion, and other intersections of personal identities that the vlogger themselves shared with the audience. So you see the quote at the bottom of the screen I have there. There are some commenters who went on to describe, I'm a disabled veteran and it's never too late. Coding had changed my life. And this is a comment on another video of someone also clarifying that they came from different careers and learned how to code and engaged. Another commenter went on to say, I'm so happy I found this video. I'm also a mom who's a software engineer and really excited and motivated to really get this show on the road. So again, figuring out how you can encourage more people to be developers, and these communities that were created around these blogs are a great way to do that. And if my slide will go, okay. So after our 3-part analyses, we identified that throughout this community building, content responses and motivations, that these vlogs were really created in some way to dismantle several types of stereotypes of developers. So we derived this stereotype framework that vlogs dismantled. So one area of this would be who can be a developer, who sees themselves as a developer. And that includes what they look like, the background, as in like their educational background or lack thereof. Another is the work life of developers. So based on their interactions with colleagues, how they collaborate in their organization as well. And then finally, the personal life of developers. So that includes where they work, how they work, and the life outside of work as well. So the full lifestyle of how people work. And this framework can really be used to understand what tools we can build to kind of dismantle some of these, and also what mechanisms people are already building on their own to kind of overcome these challenges. So vlogs is one way people are doing it. We actually wanted to compare how this may exist with developers who are in industry. So we wanted to understand the mismatch, or if there was a mismatch between what vlog developers found valuable versus developers who may not be vlogging, but are also interested in mentoring others as well. So there's a block on the screen, but I guess that didn't show. But essentially the figure on the left shows that industry developers would like to prioritize their work, or when they're showing videos, they would like to prioritize their problem solving, their mentoring, their peripheral coding tasks, again, more frequently than they actually work on tasks. So that on the right side of the diverging stacked bar chart, you see that they are more likely to show this type of content than they actually do these things. And this is not to call out that there is an overinflation, but what it does call out is that there is an emphasis on what they believe is core to the role and what they think is essential to share, right? So I want to make that very clear. And the figure on the right, which kind of has a little square blocked out right now, but it shows the percentage of developers who would allot more screen time to an activity compared to the real time spent on that task. So each column there indicates the proposed, or the column indicates the proposed motivation, and the green color cells indicate activities where at least 20% developers would allot more screen time, as in more video time, to show a task. And other ways to interpret this kind of figure is that the motivations which have an activity that are stat 6, so statistically significant, are indicated with the asterisk. So one of the ones is mentoring. So you see that if there's an interest in broader mentoring and diversity, that there was an interest in showing more of that type of content if they're trying to promote diversity, right? Same for networking. If they're trying to promote diversity in the software engineering role, they're going to show more networking, right? They're going to really be intentional about those social collaborations, that connections that are important. And I want to point out that this is also looking, we see that there is a distribution of ages here, right? So if you see in the top right hand there, I have the developer's age that, again, range span the gamut, not just Gen Zs or Gen Xs, we're looking at the range here. And I think I see a hand.
Yes, we have a clarification question.
Yes, go ahead.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I just wanted to, thank you. I just wanted to ask, for the diagram on the left, you're just measuring what happens in the vlog, but there's no normative measurement of how much time they actually spend on these tasks in their job, right? But you're just saying, well, we know that there's administrative work involved, but they don't show it. They only show 33% of that. So there might be an underinflation, and they show a lot of problem solving, but anybody who's a software engineer, no, you don't problem solve all day. So they're probably overinflating that. Am I understanding the meaning of this graph correctly?
The latter is correct. And the reason it's also important to highlight these, we've conducted several studies before, understanding the day in the life of developers based on the tasks, their hours spent on tasks. And the interesting thing here is to show how much they would inflate or overinflate that mentoring, or overshow mentoring than what they normally do in their day-to-day. So
how can I read the gap between how much time they're spending on something and how much time they're reporting or they're showing that? How do I read that in these graphics?
So on the left, you can interpret, so you're asking about how much time maybe I should show over here. the time that is between these two. Is that what you're asking about? Like, how do you interpret this digit versus this one?
I think that this is reporting what they've talked about in vlog, but you're saying that maybe they misrepresent in the vlog what their job is actually comprised of. And I'm wondering if there's a way to see the gap.
Let me clarify, because now I'm understanding your question. This figure here is actually from developers who are in industry, not bloggers, right? So we have this speculative design process we kind of ask them to go through, right? Of like, if you were to be this creator, right? If you were kind of be on this platform where people, if your goal was to showcase the day in the life of what you do every day in a blog, what do you think is most important to show, right? So again, these are developers. And the reason I'm highlighting these experiences is because previously we were looking at only the bloggers who were engaging in the platform. So we're really comparing their types of perceptions of what they find valuable.
Thank you so much. That clarifies it. Thank you.
Yes. So to clarify, and I didn't call this out, but at the bottom of the slide between this one and the one I was on before, these are actually two different papers. So the first one here, when I was talking about the 3-part analyses of understanding the developer vlogs, we were again focusing on people who do create this content. And then the former, the latter one I'm describing was actually how does it compare to folks in industry, right? So one thing I think is really important to call out here as well is that the age distribution of developers who completed the survey, it's quite a range, as I mentioned before, but we're still seeing significant differences across motivations. So maybe there is another way we should be defining or analyzing what a generation or the differences across generations may look like. So I have a set of open questions, right? So maybe age alone doesn't define or yield the intended results of what we'd be thinking about. I think this is why I'm also considering what we consider to be intergenerational sets of developers in intergenerational settings, because age is only one attribute. There are different ones that we're identifying from the study, such as the motivations, that interest in the type of impact they want to have, that interest in the transition from non-traditional career paths, for example. Or maybe, again, the broader interest in, how that project or what they're doing can change the world. So that's kind of like the transition into that next set of studies I was talking about before, which is the opportunity for the next generation of intergenerational developers to think about what the societal impact of their work can have. So, this uptick in people wanting to help others is something we saw in this altruism that exists offline. So thinking about even the pandemic, how people are helping others and researchers and others were using their skills to support others. We're curious to see how developers are doing that in practice. So in understanding the importance of the societal impact of projects, I'll talk a little bit about the work we've done to support the developers from this open source for social good perspectives. So collaborating on projects that are large and small, and they're designed or geared at supporting a broader society. And then if you're interested in more about this project, I have a link below that goes to the project website too, so you can follow along and ask questions if you're interested. So open source software, or OSS, which I'll say probably often throughout the talk, has enhanced the tools that developers build, and likewise inspire developers to consider how the tools they build can support the greater good. However, when we often refer to OSS, we often consider the projects that are building developer tools or extending libraries to popular programming language projects in Python like TensorFlow or JavaScript like React. And although contributions to these types of projects and OSS projects are valuable to the community, there are other galvanizing projects with broader impacts that inspire developers to contribute to open source software. And specifically, projects that directly benefit society. So many of which have been to support people in the US or even others globally during COVID. So here, for example, I have two projects, one on the left, which is this COVID tracking project, and then which is really centered around how developers are building tools to track the impacts of COVID in the US. And on the right, I have this other COVID tracking or corona tracking project here, which is really understanding the impacts of their community globally, how people are getting engaged with COVID, what resources they have at their disposal. And then I want to also highlight that these are only two that kind of emerged during the pandemic. But before this, there were also open source projects geared at changing the lives of others. And they're fewer in quantity compared to the others, but very powerful in influence. So two in particular that I want to call out are Little Window on the left, which you see in the GIF, which supports victims of intimate partner violence and provides resources to leave abusive relationships. And then on the right, we have Refuge Restroom, which identifies safe restrooms for trans, intersex, non-binary, and gender non-conforming individuals. So I call out these projects because, again, these are opportunities that we see developers really focusing on how their software they're building can impact society, targets a specific group of people or community of people, and helps them overcome a societal issue. So in this work, we really defined or really understood how to build on some of the work in the social sector that a lot of people may be familiar with if you're connecting with NGOs, where we're figuring out how the tool builders of these sectors are engaging. So we're learning a lot from what other people have also done as well. So here at Microsoft, we have relationships with GitHub and other organizations. And the GitHub Social Impact team actually conducted a lot of studies before understanding the relationship NGOs had, non-government organizations had, and project organizers in interacting with open source. So we're understanding the understudied experiences of people who have been trying to make this impact. But particular for the work that I was doing, I wanted to understand how we could look at it from the developer perspective. Again, people who are on the ground building tools. And in computer science education, we see a lot of how the impacts of the work or understanding how the impacts of the tools you're building can empower others has been used as a tool to motivate people from marginalized backgrounds, right? You've seen it as when you talk about the impact of the work, you're trying to get more women into computing, right? You've seen it again for people like Black and Brown people and students as well. So we wanted to see if the same concepts used in computer science education, if they can also be used here in open source to see if there is a difference in the demographic of now who feels empowered to contribute, who feels empowered to build projects to support a broader society. And again, we're building on the social sector report, so I also have that link there as well. And we want to understand better what are the motivations they're facing, the challenges, and then some of their project selection strategies. So to conduct the study, we kind of took the sequential mixed methods approach, where we're understanding, again, qualitatively, what are the builders of these projects facing, and then quantitatively looking at some of their, the impact of that work, or how they're understanding the motivations and challenges as well. So we draw on the Digital Public Goods Alliance. So that's the United Nations, the Secretary kind of had this initiative to figure out how to make digital public goods accessible. We're also drawing on OVO social impact because GitHub did not have their own list of social impact projects, because that's a whole nother conversation we can have about how projects can change over time. And then we're also looking at the sustainable development goals to map the project that we're identifying to goals that align with the United Nations sustainable initiatives that they've already outlined. So next, I'm going to kind of go over some of the results of this study. And we'll start off with the interest in that proximity of impact. So again, to better understand the impact developers wanted to have, we investigated their project selection strategies. And one way we used to do this is we adopted Construal's levels of psychological distance and adopted it to our framework to understand the proximity of impact participants wanted to have in their project. So in this study, we had a collection of open source developers, as well as open source for social good developers. And I'm skipping over a little bit of the division of how we identified them or how they self-identified themselves, just for the sake of time, but I'm happy to talk more about that as well. And so using Construal's levels of psychological distance, we came up with this proximity impact framework. And what we're seeing here, and I highlighted in purple, where we're looking at the spatial proximity, as in that physical distance, the temporal proximity, as in the time needed, the time dependency of this type of project, and then the social proximity of who it impacts, a stranger or versus someone that you know. And we saw that overall, open source for social good contributors were more thoroughly investigated or invested in the owners of the projects, but they tended to prioritize the projects that met global needs, had long-term benefits, but also supported their personal connections, right? So they were interested in the projects that had a range of impact that they could feel like they were changing the world, if you will, right? Can sustain a longitudinal type of impact, and then one that they felt was adjacent or aligned with their connections. So again, understanding more about that project selection strategy, again, we identified that the difference, we had developers identify themselves as their social good projects versus their open source projects, and where social good projects are ones that identify societal impact, that they identify themselves, the developers. We see that there is an overwhelming interest in the trust of who the organizer of the project is. So in short, developers were really interested in knowing who built that project. They may be a little bit more trustworthy if it was a project coming from a grassroots organization or developers who were just rallying together to build a tool rather than a large tech conglomerate, if you will, right? Likewise, we did see on the open source side, there was also a lot of interest in how they can enhance their skills rather than on the social good side, right? So again, more people were just motivated to help solve a broader issue. And then another slide that I don't have included as well is that the social good cohort of individuals was significantly impacted or motivated by the societal impact that their project can have. On the challenges perspective, on the challenges side, we were looking at different opportunities and maybe gaps that we could be filling. And the two that I highlight, were not significant, but I wanted to highlight them because they've also been resonating with other folks as I'm talking with them, even within Microsoft, where not knowing where to find the projects to work on, which is a broader open source issue. And then also identifying the funding opportunities. So there are, there's a tool on GitHub and it's called, shoot, I can't remember the name of it right this second, but there is a new tool, a format where you can actually fund developers to work on different projects. Sponsors is what it's called. And then in the Octoverse 2020 report and the social impact report, we've been highlighting some of these opportunities to explore deeper. And I'll talk a little bit about something we're doing to kind of build upon these as well. Some broader takeaways from this work. And if you're familiar with the Digital Public Goods Alliance, then you may know that they already have a lot of human manual review of some projects that get nominated. Again, I mentioned one of the challenges that resonated with the broader community is how they identify social good projects. People who want to help don't know where to go. So we're thinking about ways we can maybe automate some of that process and in tandem with some of the human verification as well. So right now there's a nomination portal you have to go through, but there are different attributes of projects that we can identify, right? So you can see the description box of the project, the type of goals they have. You can read from their contributing guidelines, the type of impact they hope to have and what other organizations they're partnered with. So maybe there's other ways you can be considering how to automate, like low-hanging fruit, automate some of and highlight the certified social impact projects. On the other side, as well as understanding the opportunities for contributing to open source for social good projects, the people who contribute to these projects find themselves sometimes at risk. So I mentioned some of the projects like the Restroom Refuge and the Intimate Partner Violence one, which was Little Window. There are also projects like centered around humanitarian causes, like the Ukraine relief, right? So thinking about more polarizing political issues or sensitive societal issues. We should be also thinking about how we're keeping these developers working on these projects safe, because there is a high risk, these are high stakes projects. So there may be people highly depending on these resources. But those who do contribute to open source on these projects also have a lot of emphasis or like a target on their back in some ways, right? Where people now know who's contributing to these things, and that may put them at risk for doxing and just other potential risky situations as well. Jeremy. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly as well.
You did, thank you. Just quick question. I was also thinking of the possible risks to the users of the software. So for instance, if the bathrooms aren't updated and you get sent to the wrong bathroom, or if you have a notification in little window that your partner, your abusive partner sees or something like that. I'm wondering if there's any thought to that when looking at these projects.
This is a great question, Jeremy. And these open source projects, like other open source for social good projects, so think about open source and then versus social good, there are broader sustainability issues, right? So these projects suffer with maintainers. So the maintainers are burnt out. And as we become more dependent on these systems, the same in the broader open source communities, right? When large tech companies are depending on softwares, when there's only one maintainer, managing the project, we need to think about how we can create this pathway, if you will, of incoming new developers, raising up or actively supporting the engaged developers so that we can eventually promote them to be maintainers, right? So again, this multi-stage process. And something that my interns and I were working on this past summer, we're thinking about how we can support them through these multi-stages as well. So where we built this kind of prototype of this recommendation system to one, help maintainers identify rising contributors because they're overloaded. So we want to make it easier for them. And we're doing that by looking at or highlighting the different types of, or encouraging them to also do that by having project recommendations to have good first issues, and also highlight the social impact of some of the work that they're doing as well. And again, although this work has been tested on social good projects, we're intentionally thinking about how we're scaling to open source communities broadly. I think it's just helpful to have a very specific use case, again, targeting the few or learning from the few to help the many. Also, we're also looking at ways we can align this with the societal impact and again, foster more sustainable communities. So I talked a little bit, or this dashboard I have in the background is a maintainer dashboard where we're highlighting the opportunities for maintainers, but we're also looking at opportunities to promote skills for developers to grow in, right? Because again, in the graph I showed, it's something of interest to social good developers and OSS developers as well. And then likewise, thinking about pairing projects, contributors with projects, helping them find the project that they're interested and invested in. So we're tinkering with that a bit, and actually some of the insights of how we're quantitatively highlighting the rising contributors has actually been featured in GitHub's Insights dashboard. So they've been using this figure of how we're talking about highlighting again, new contributors who are actively engaged from month to month, who's being retained, and they're using that type of way of presenting that data now in their discussions forum, so the Q&A forum they're using to promote non-code contributors. So that was kind of really exciting to see recently. And there's links to these papers below as well. Looks like I have a little bit more time. So I'm going to talk lightly about hybrid work and then maybe open up the floor to some more broader Q&A after that too. That's going to be mindful of time. So another core area that I'm proposing that we're looking at is the hybrid work setting, right? So learning from a lot of our remote work studies to really understand how we can better support that flexibility in setting to usher in the next generation of developers. They care a lot about their autonomy, right? And actually we've seen this again, pre-pandemic, investigating how a lot of large tech companies were already remote first. Many of you may already know this, like companies like Stack Overflow, GitHub, and even GitLab have been remote first for years. So I used to work a lot with Stack Overflow on their mentorship program. So data from the American Community Survey, which I have here on remote work from 2017, has really even demonstrated that computer scientists, more than art and design, more than personal care and management and finance, as you all could imagine, were already working from home more frequently at higher rates than a lot of other fields. And this trend is also reflected up into the pandemic. So looking at GitLab's remote work report, which they published early in 2020, actually, it technically got published like the first week of March, right before the pandemic, but they were already having their annual report that they were sharing about the different advantages and attitudes towards supporting remote work and figuring out how to best kind of support their employees as they do this. So it's really been a helpful playbook for others, companies who are trying to consider how to do this. Myself and some of my colleagues have also done a little bit of remote work in research in 2017 where we're really identifying how remote work has unique advantages for people from marginalized groups, so marginalized developers specifically. So looking at how they have more control over how their identity is shared. So they may have more control over their work setting, how much they engage or disengage with work, so they can have their camera on and off during meetings. And even their flexibility of economically stable work. So again, thinking about how you can transition careers. I mean, we don't talk about this a lot, but there's people who are technically at tech companies working multiple jobs, right? Because they are working remotely, so they're able to balance and have this different type of economic advantage that they wouldn't have had elsewise. And I should highlight this specifically because for that study I mentioned, we were looking at trans and non-binary developers and looking at the advantages for them. But again, really, again, having that autonomy, how they can engage and disengage with their physical work settings and how that empowers them to feel more confident in their work. And the pandemic happened, they were starting to see that even more and more emphasized. So throughout the pandemic, we kind of conducted these 3 remote work studies. And for the sake of time, I'm only going to briefly cover some of the impact of that work. And then the studies I'm going to focus on are the remote onboarding and the team productivity. And in the combination of these studies, we analyzed survey responses from 875 developers, project managers, and other technologists at Microsoft. And the other study has a ton more, but I'm only going to focus on these for now, where we're qualitatively understanding the challenges of remote onboarding, and then also quantitatively building these models to understand how team culture and other factors can really influence collaboration and communication styles. So I am intentionally not going to go into the meat of these findings or the meat of the methodology. I'm really going to only click on selected findings. So at a high level, understanding the challenges that people have had, and I'm going to connect them back to think about hybrid work as well. They're seeing that a lot of the challenges faced have been that people aren't being as comfortable asking for help. I should have prefaced this before. I did a lot of work in help seeking for Stack Overflow and looking at how people from marginalized groups are asking questions and then learning how we can support a broader community of people asking for help. There's also challenges in identifying meaningful and sustainable connections with other humans that they work with. And then of course, there's other physical challenges such as the hardware and permissions issues, getting devices on time, as well as also finding the correct documentation. When you don't feel comfortable asking the right person, if you don't feel comfortable asking someone, how are you gonna find the right resources? And that's the beauty of online communities, right? So they're there for when you don't feel comfortable asking for help from a person. You can find an online question, right? And insert the discussion and the answers that have been supported around that. So again, looking at how people have been working in hybrid work settings before, in Stack Overflow, in open source, where we're learning a lot. And there's some helpful workarounds that people have built up, such as having active communication channels. In fact, having communication standards and guidelines that have been agreed upon for across the community. And then thinking about tools we can use or ways that we can automate or scale up some of these recommendations. And one that I'll emphasize is, or maybe pose it to you all to kind of think about as well, is how we're scaling up some of our human-to-human interactions through these tools and communities as well. And by learning how people have done it in open source and on social Q&A platforms before. So one of them is assigning this onboarding buddy. So thinking about the ways we can provide technical help to folks through the tools that they use. So one idea is kind of actually proposing this alerts to encourage people while they're coding to engage with their onboarding buddy. There's other tools that people have been using in Microsoft as well that have been building their homegrown tools to kind of support this type of interaction. I want to also posit quickly about some future opportunities to consider to support the next generation of developers. So in looking at some of the opportunities for how to better support the intergeneration and the next generation, I personally lean a lot on the computer science education community because they have been considerable studies and interventions really kind of geared at supporting K-12 and university even learning strategies. And we're learning a lot from how to help support adult transitions. So on the left there, I have an example of MakeCode, which if you all may not be familiar, is the block-based programming environment, where in the GIF I have there's someone tinkering between the block-based environment and the actual code. And on the right, I have a snippet from Pelly, who is actually one of the faces of Make Code here at Microsoft Research, and is really walking someone through that push and pull process of how you contribute to GitHub. That's one example of how people are getting really specific with how to encourage people to code. But there's also a host of low code tools as well that are people building. So there's tools like Power Apps from Microsoft. And there's a host of others that people are using to kind of at least build up their preliminary mock-up of their tools that they're building in ways that are exciting to them. So in thinking about how we support the next generation of developers, we should be thinking about, again, those no code or low code scenarios that get people to build the tool or build the technology they're excited about, that they're passionate about, that they have the resources to build remotely in whatever setting. And then later on, give them the opportunity to connect and amplify that work. So likewise, there may be opportunities to think about how we're engaging with the communities, or how we're thinking about how the current next generation of developers, so thinking about those who are in university settings now, are engaging with tools and communities, how they may be engaging with communication platforms now, but then how can we incorporate that into tools that they can use when they get to the full-time world, right? So there's tools like VS Code Live Share, which is really geared at collaboration, where you can have a link, you can join someone's live share session. And these really are just these evolved IRCs, if you will, where you're actually able to like collaborate with folks. So think about Google Docs, right? And you're able to really do that here for developers. And in the way we're kind of figure out how we can better support the tools that new programmers use, the settings they're already comfortable in, because they're going to be building their own tools eventually as well. There's also opportunities for thinking about what this means for AI coding environments and programming environments as well. So with the emergence of tools like Tab9 and GitHub, we should also ponder the unintended consequences that may come to the fore as we prepare for the next generation of developers. So for instance, thinking about those who may feel snuffed if you use tools like this, and you may be branded as not a real developer, right? But we should be thinking broader about what that definition of developer means, right? How are we putting labels on things? And I really wanted to charge us more to think a little bit more about the impact of these tools. A lot of the work that I'm coming up soon is kind of looking at how developers build and trust in these systems, especially since they have a unique technical expertise that the broader population may not have. So thinking about how that factors into how we better support them. So as I'm wrapping up this talk, the question here is, how do we better prepare for the next generation of developers? I would say that, it comes to thinking about how to help them overcome barriers. What are the better retention techniques we should be thinking of? How do we reduce burnout and reduce the presence of bad actors who may be using this content for malicious acts? And then thinking about reasonable ways to scale growth and build upon community metrics that help us build a sustainable community. The question I had earlier was, how do we empower more people to become software developers? But perhaps the better question here is, what are we doing now that helps prepare us for the next generation of developers? So we can, again, prepare for them, bring them into the fold, and think about the intergeneration of developers. So with that, I'll close by thanking my amazing collaborators, interns, visiting researchers, and academic partners who are also helping me think through the next generation of developers and really figuring out how we can support developers and technologists through their journey.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.